Hello, my name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. This week we're going to be taking a look at Joseph as we continue to look at profiles of faith. Now, just as a recap, let's go through and talk a little bit about Joseph and the role that he plays in fulfilling God's plan. If you remember, God makes a promise to Abraham as Abraham leaves his family and goes to the land of Canaan, that God's going to bless him and his descendants, and he's going to give them this land of promise. And so Abraham goes to that land of promise, that land of Canaan, and he dwells there, and he has a son named Isaac. And Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob has 12 sons. And Joseph is one of those 12 sons. And so we start to see here the growth of Abraham's lineage. What is going to be called the people of Israel, Jacob was also known as Israel, really starts with Jacob, Israel, and his sons. However, before they are a full-fledged nation, they have difficulties coming. There's going to be a drought that goes through the land of Canaan and throughout most of the known world. And they are in danger of not having enough food, of possibly losing their riches, losing their land, maybe having to go somewhere where God did not want them to go, and maybe even starving and dying and not being able to fulfill the promise that way. But of course we know the Lord, He always keeps His promises, and so He made a way of provision for them. And it was a way that nobody expected. And that was through Joseph. And so Joseph is one of, as we mentioned, 12 sons of Jacob. Now, Jacob had 4 wives, and one of the things that we see is that Rachel was his favorite. And so as a part of that, Joseph actually was his favorite son. And we see that this becomes a point of tension between him and his brothers. On top of that, we see that he gives a bad report, that Jacob gives him a coat of many colors. And so the brothers become quite envious, and then Joseph has these dreams where he talks about how he is going to be over all of his brothers one day, that they're going to bow down to him and be subservient to him. Well, they don't like this, so they go and they sell him into slavery. And what we find is that this was actually God's plan. This is how God was going to allow for the people of Israel to be able to survive the famine that is coming. It's a plan that is years in the making, and Joseph has to go through a lot of difficulties to play God's role in this particular plan. But it is what God uses. So Joseph goes into captivity. He is sold to the Egyptians. He's sold to Potiphar. And when he works with Potiphar, it goes very well. Potiphar completely trusts him. And unfortunately, Potiphar has an evil wife. And his wife tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph stands strong and refuses to do something that is sinful. And so Potiphar's wife, spurned, winds up leveling this unjust accusation against him, saying that he had came on to her, that he was trying to assault her. And so Potiphar takes his wife's side, and Joseph is thrown into jail. While in jail, again, he's put into a position of prominence. He is trusted by the prison guards, so that way he actually, in many ways, is running the prison. And he runs into 2 of Pharaoh's servants who were thrown into jail, and they had dreams. Now, Joseph had dreams earlier that we talked about his brothers and even his father bowing down to him. And this was a gift that God had given him, that he was able to interpret dreams. And so he interprets dreams for them, one of them being dreams that were the cupbearer would be able to go back in front of Pharaoh. And then we have the baker, and he was going to be killed by Pharaoh. He does tell the cupbearer when he goes into Pharaoh's service to remember him and to put in a good word with Pharaoh so that Joseph might be free. But the cupbearer forgets about him, at least for a while, until Pharaoh has this dream that nobody can interpret. there are these 7 cows that are fat and plenty, and then there are 7 skinny cows. And the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat cows, and nobody can interpret this dream. And Pharaoh's wondering who can come and tell him what's going to happen with this dream. Well, then all of a sudden the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Joseph comes forward, he interprets the dreams, he gives a plan for what Pharaoh should do in order to be prepared, and he is made second in the kingdom. When this happens, of course, what we see later is that as this drought comes that God had been preparing for all this time, where Joseph was in servitude to Pharaoh or to Potiphar's house, all this time that he was in jail, the 7 years of plenty, and even a few of the years where the drought was bad, that God was using all of this time to put Joseph in a place so that way Abraham's offspring would be protected. And so eventually we see Jacob and his sons do come to Egypt, and Joseph is able to protect them and give them food, and they grow and become a mighty nation that then eventually leaves. And so we see all of this with Joseph and how God uses him. And I think that this account is really important for us to study and to understand because of the faith that it shows in Joseph. Now, I'll be honest with you, a lot of times when I think about Joseph and when I recount this story, what I really focus on is his integrity. And that's a good thing to focus on. Joseph has a lot of integrity, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But why does he have such integrity? What is it about Joseph that means he's willing to go to prison and he's still going to be somebody who is trustworthy? He's still going to be honorable in everything that he does. Not once do we see him get angry at God. Not once do we see him stop trying to be an upright, righteous man. Why not? Well, I think part of this comes from what we see originally in Genesis chapter 37. Starting in verse 5, it says, "Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf rose up and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf.' His brothers said to him, 'Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and his word. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers, and said, 'Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?' And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind." A lot of times when we look at Joseph telling his dreams, we tend to create a narrative around what happens here. And the idea is we see Joseph as this arrogant person who then becomes humbled and then is, because of that humility, is raised to prominence. But I'm not sure that's exactly the point that is trying to be brought out in these visions that Joseph talks about. Instead, what I think we see is the relationship that he has with God and the foundation of Joseph's faith. I think it's interesting in verse 11, it talks about his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. His father remembered this and was thinking about what it is that it might mean. Now, these dreams being something to remember and meditate on would have made a lot of sense for Jacob, because Jacob had his own dream as he was going out from his father because he was worried his brother Esau was going to kill him. God comes to him in a dream and tells him about his protection. On top of that, we see that Abraham was viewed as a friend of God, and God and Abraham have constant conversations. And so Joseph, as he's telling about this dream, he is a prophet speaking prophecy. And I think that not only did his father keep this saying in mind, but I think that Joseph did as well. And sometimes, because we don't see it as much in the accounts, we don't see the conversations that Jacob had with his sons. We may forget all of the history that they may have talked about, how Jacob might have talked about Abraham and what happened with Abraham, and how Abraham had lived in faith and what God had done, how he had promised him about his family going to be this great nation, and the faith that Abraham had in Isaac being the way that this promise would be fulfilled. Even though God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, he was willing to do it because he believed in the promise of God. He wasn't sure how God was going to make it happen, but he believed. That's the same faith that we see in Joseph. Joseph is one who believes that God is going to use him, and God is going to protect him and elevate him. And so these dreams then are foundational for everything that's going to happen throughout the rest of Joseph's life. As he's going through being sold into slavery, as he's going through being put into prison, he is remembering that God promised him that he would be elevated. Not in an arrogant way, but understanding, I think, that God was going to use him and be able to have him there as a protector for his lineage, and as we see, the rest of his family as well. And so that faith is what continues to drive Joseph. If you remember what happens when Joseph is confronted by Potiphar's wife, he mentions a couple of different things about his integrity. He talks about how Potiphar has left nothing away from him, and that it would be an abuse of Potiphar's trust to then have this physical relationship with Potiphar's wife. But he also talks about how could he sin against God in this way. Joseph had that relationship with God, that love for God, that obedience to God. And so everything that he does is about fulfilling that relationship with God. And that really brings us to the second point that I want us to talk about, is, again, thinking about the integrity that Joseph had. Joseph was somebody who always did a good job in what he did. And we see this time and time again in the trust that is given to him by Potiphar, the trust that is given to him by the prison guards, and the trust that is given to him by Pharaoh. That's not something that you just do automatically. And we think about this with our jobs today. If you were to be hired on day one, they're going to be curious on what you're going to do. They don't know you yet. They're getting to see how you work, the type of person that you are. And so you've got to build up that trust. It's not something that is just blindly given, and you know it's not going to be given to a slave, as Joseph was when he came in Potiphar. And then you have someone who comes into prison. He's a prisoner. He's accused of assaulting Potiphar's wife. How does he get to a point where they're like, yeah, sure, you run the prison? It's because he had integrity in his walk. And so it's very important for us as Christians, when we are having the type of faith that Joseph has, like his great-grandfather Abraham, that we act honestly, that we act uprightly, and so that people know that what we say we're going to do, we do. That they know that they don't have to double-check our work, that they don't have to wonder if we are stealing from them or defrauding them in some way, trying to take advantage of them, because they know that we are going to do right, because that's who we are. And with that, we need to understand that God uses our lives as a training ground, sometimes for something great. Joseph was the one who was put as second in command for the greatest nation in the known world at that time. He had this incredible prestige and this incredible power. But I want you to notice that this is something that, in many ways, I think he had been preparing for his entire life. We notice in Genesis 37, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, when you first read this and you see Joseph as a 17-year-old telling his father that his brothers weren't doing a good job, our first instinct might be to think of him as a tattletale. That's typically what we think of our siblings whenever they were telling that we didn't do a good job. And so it's natural to associate that in this type of situation. However, I do think that it's worth noting what Joseph does later on as well in the integrity factors that he has in all the jobs that he does. That Joseph was someone who, when you were in charge of something, whenever you had a job, you were supposed to do it right. You were supposed to do it well. He was that person of integrity. And so when he's out there, he's shepherding the flock. He's pasturing this flock. And it is important to him that they do a good job. His father said, "This is your job. I am entrusting you with these sheep. You need to do well." Well, then his brothers aren't doing it. And so he is conflicted, and he's put in this tough position because he knows that he's supposed to do what his father said, but his brothers are not doing that. And so we see, again, that integrity happening from a very young age. And it was something that when he was given a position of authority, he was going to do the best that he could. And so the same thing happens whenever we see Genesis chapter 39. It says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt." This is after he had been sold to slavers. "And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had brought him before the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate." So again, notice the type of person that Joseph is here. He comes in, and as we mentioned, somebody who builds trust. He could have been bitter about what had happened. The last time he tried to act with integrity, it made his brothers mad, and they sold him into slavery. And where is this God who had given him this dream of him being in this elevated position, and now he's been sold to slavers who sold him to Potiphar in Egypt? That's not what Joseph does. Instead, he acts with integrity, and he works hard to be a good manager of Potiphar's house. And everything that he does is blessed. And yes, it does talk about the Lord blessing him in what he does. And that's definitely a part of Joseph's success. But another part of it is the way that Joseph manages things, the type of person that he is, the work that he puts in. When he is given a responsibility, he steps up and he takes it. Then we see what happens with Potiphar's wife, and what we see happening there is actually very similar to what we just talked about with Joseph's brothers. Joseph has been given the responsibility of the entire house. And he mentions that Potiphar has given him everything to take care of except for his wife. That's the only thing that Potiphar has kept for himself. And the idea is how can I do this? How can I be a righteous person? How can I be someone who has been given the responsibility of Pharaoh and abuse that trust in this way, then he's thrown into prison. So you can imagine that Joseph now, he had integrity with his brothers. That didn't go so well. They sold him into slavery. He had integrity with Potiphar. That also did not go so well. That integrity got him thrown into prison. He would have been much better off if he didn't have integrity and just done what Potiphar's wife had wanted. But that's not who Joseph was. And again, he doesn't blame the Lord. He doesn't stop being the type of person that God calls him to be. It says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed." So again, we see that Joseph comes in and he does an amazing job as a leader of this prisoner. And again, we see that Potiphar made it to where he didn't concern himself with anything except for what he was going to eat that day. The prisoner guard, he said, you know what? If Joseph's in charge of it, I don't even have to double check it because Joseph has that integrity. Why is this important? Because we see here that Joseph was using these opportunities of authority to learn how to manage things. He was learning how it was that he could take care of things and be responsible with whatever authority he was given. And so in Genesis 41 verse 33, after he interprets the dreams, he says, "Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land and Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for the food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." Right after this, we see that Pharaoh realizes that Joseph is the man who should be put in charge of this. He talks about how it should be a discerning and wise man over the land of Egypt. Joseph was ready for this role. Why? Because he had been preparing for it his entire life. He had been shepherding a flock, and now he was ready to shepherd the people of Egypt. He had been put in charge of everything of Potiphar's. He had been put in charge of everything in the prison. And now, because he was already used to that type of authority, he already knew how to use it honorably and with integrity and righteousness, he is going to be put in charge of the land of Egypt. Why does this matter? Because as Christians, a lot of times we want to jump to the end. We want to find a way to serve God in the big, expansive way that Joseph does when he becomes second in command to Pharaoh. But sometimes God calls us to do the smaller things, to be responsible for a smaller item. That should not be something we take any less seriously. And in fact, what we also need to remember is that this is preparing us so we can take on more responsibility in the future. God is expecting us to practice using our gifts in small ways, so that way when the big moment comes, when we need to do something for God's kingdom, something that we may not have even realized we have been preparing for our whole lives, we are ready. God didn't choose just anybody to fulfill this plan. He didn't choose any of the other brothers. He chose Joseph specifically. And Joseph was prepared for that by the way that he lived his life. When you see the stories of the other brothers, it seems to me apparent that they would not have been the right ones for this, that it would not have worked out in the way that God intended. And so, of course, we see the wisdom of who God chose. But we should always be preparing ourselves so that when God chooses us, when God calls us, we are ready. Because we have been using our skills in the small ways. We have proven ourselves over a little, so that way we can prove ourselves over the great things. I hope this lesson has been a blessing to you and your walk